Part 16, here we go. So last time we had created a whole load of variables, arrays, all in the name of trying to make an e-liquid. So yeah, we've basically got all of the data that we need now. All we need to do is spit it out on the form. However, we need to make some changes to the form. Now, the vast majority of it, if we open up the old mix form here a minute, you'll see that a lot of this is just boring static data. We filled a lot of it in. A lot of it we're not even going to bother to fill in, like this cost stuff. The comments is just typing. But the important part of what we're trying to do is to stick all the ingredients in this embedded form. So to save confusion, I'm not opening it there. I'm opening that embedded form by itself. And this is basically all we need to fill in. All of this work that we've been doing on this create button, more or less, is to fill in this little form here. And there will be one of these rows per ingredient. So it's going to have an ID, which is kind of irrelevant. It's going to have the ID of the mix, which is also irrelevant really for us. It needs it in the background, but we're not interested. And then we have the name. So we have the mix, the ingredient name, the ingredient percentage, the ingredient volume, the ingredient weight, the cost we're not bothering with for a minute. And then underneath all of that is where we're going to have which bottle of ingredient that we've used for this mix, and then the amount of that, and then possibly another bottle of the ingredient and how much we used of that, and possibly, and very unlikely, but another bottle of that ingredient and how much we used. So at this stage of the game, we're not really interested in deciding how these bottles are going to be filled out. That is something that's going to come later. That is something the tool cannot do quite yet. We will get it to sort of suggest some bottles for us based on what the actual ingredient name is. It can limit the list of bottles down to bottles which are of that ingredient. But we're not going to bother with that for now. What we do need to do though is we need to at least stick in the total volume of this ingredient that we want. And obviously we can't predict that that's going to be 1 bottle, 2 bottles or 3 bottles. So we'll just stick the whole amount in the bottle 1 position, if you like, which is here. So just to get ready to receive that data, I have changed the name of that field to stock ing vol _1. This one to _2 and this one to _3. And that's about it for now. We also have this little field up here, which we spoke about before, which just maintains a running total of what we've selected so far. But again, that really is coming later when we move on to actually selecting the bottles. So let's close that thing down and save it and get back to our code. So what we need to do now is to create a bit of code that's going to fill in all of those fields that we just looked at from all of the information that we sort of gathered and calculated here. So I'm going to stick that code in now. And as you'll see, I haven't actually stuck anything in this, whatever it's called, the create button code. Before I'm doing that, because we're effectively filling out, and let's just have a quick look at it to remind ourselves, because we are filling out, and let's make this a bit bigger actually, select that, we're going to make this old embedded form here a bit bigger so we can see it here better, and more importantly so we can see it when it's open better. Yeah, what was I saying? Yeah, that's right. Because this is a multi-item form, so there's basically, this is one of the ingredients and then it's going to repeat for however many ingredients there are in this recipe. So basically we'll be filling in the same information, although slightly, different for each ingredient, but effectively the same fields we're going to be filling in over and over again. Which means that we want to stick that off into a subroutine because we don't want to repeat effectively exactly the same code over and over again when we could just repeat the same code and feed some different information into it. So for that reason, I have created a new subroutine here called JD_pop mix ings. And what that's going to take in is some variables. So when we call this, we will pass in the relevant data for the ingredient that we're looking at. We're going to pass in the mix ID. We're going to pass in the mix ingredient name. It's got T in it, meaning this mix ingredient name, this percentage, this volume, and this weight. And that is kind of all we need to take in. And then what it's going to do is it's going to select our child subform, give it focus. If it needs to create a new record, because don't forget each one of these is a record, so the first time around it's going to have a new record already selected for us, so we could just fill that in. But after that we need to create a new record each time, i.e. when for each ingredient. So that's what this does. Yeah, creates a new record if it's needed. Then all we simply do is for each one of those fields on that subform is we stick in the information that's been passed to this subroutine. So, not surprisingly, the mix ID gets the mix ID, the ingredient name gets the ingredient name, the ingredient percentage gets the ingredient percentage, the volume gets the volume, which is just rounded to 2 decimal places. The same with the weight. Ignore this little comment for a minute. This is a little note for me to deal with later on. And then basically that first stock ingredient volume field that we just added into here is going to receive the total quantity of that ingredient that we require, which is the mix ing vol, which is the same as the total vol, obviously. And then the running total will also be the same as that, because yeah, we've kind of completed all of the mixing volume that we wanted all on one ingredient. So that is done. Now what we need to do is just on the end of this bit of code up here, back on our create button code, is we need to call this any number of times depending on how many ingredients we got. So I will now stick that code in. Aha, so here we are. I have now stuck this in. Basically, I've got a few comments here. So what we're going to do first is, because don't forget these are writing out to that subform. So if I require a certain order of the ingredients to come out, which I do, then I need to send them to that in the order I want them. And the order I want them is nicotine first. So basically we are calling this subroutine to fill in these fields, and we are passing it the data it needs. So the mix ID, the name of the nick index, the percentage with the nick index, the base volume, and the weight of the nick. Do the same for the VG here, the same for the PG, and then basically this down here will just keep a running total of the weight of the mix. So basically it's adding up these here, the weight of the nick, the weight of the VG, the weight of the PG, and that gives us our total weight for this mix as we go forward. Then we run through all of the other ingredients, which are basically going to be flavorings. So we just do that in a loop, and we're basically calling the same subroutine, that one there, for each of the other ingredients, passing the same data over, but for each of the ingredients, well, flavorings. And again, we're just continuing our running total of the weight. Once we've done that, that is this little form here all filled out. It should have a row for each ingredient and all the data in that we need. So then what we do is move back to the main table, we're talking about the main form here, and continue filling in the bits and pieces there, of which there is not a great deal. So we set the focus back to the main form, we set the focus back to the volume field, which happens to be at the top, because after it's finished filling in this form here, it's going to end up down at the bottom, and we would rather have it at the top. So it's just going to set focus back up there so we can see where we are. It's then going to just populate the date of the mix with the current date. It's then going to populate the recipe ID with our global recipe ID, and it's going to stick in the sum total of all of the weights that we've added together to give us a complete weight for the mix, and it's going to stick that in the mix calc weight field and round it off to 2 decimal places. The final thing that it's going to do is it's going to enable the consume button. So that should kind of give us our recipe with all the calculations. So let's give it a test. Let's close this down. Let's close that down. Yes. Let's open a control panel. Let's select a recipe with VG and PG so it doesn't tell us there isn't any. And let's make a mix of that. So let's say, for argument's sake, we're going to make 200. 200 ml, we click create, and there we go. It's bounced us back up to the top. So running from the top to the bottom, the mix ID it's created itself. The recipe ID is one passed over and it just happens to be the same as that. We can get rid of this. Now we've finished kind of testing. It's given us the recipe name, the VG-PG split, the nicotine level, the date of the mix, the cost we haven't done yet, and the mix calc weight. So that is the total number in grams that this mix should weigh, which just helps me do a little bit of a sanity check when I've mixed it all up. Before I start mixing, I weigh the empty bottle. Then when I finish mixing, I weigh the full bottle, and I can put those two in there, and hopefully that value there should equal the sum of the full weight minus the empty weight, give or take. But it's just a sort of ballpark sanity check. These down here are just text fields that I'll enter when I make the mix, just for comments really. But the important part and all the donkey work is in this subform. So as you can see, for each ingredient within our recipe, it has pulled out some IDs, which we're not particularly interested in. I'll get rid of those. It's given us the name. It's given us the volume that we want for this particular. So basically for 200 ml of this mix, we need 8.33 ml of our nicotine base. And that works out to 10.35 grams. We haven't done the costing, so we can ignore that. And for the time being, it's just said we need 8.33, which is the total, and the running total is the same. So basically what will happen is when we move on to the next stages, we will select the actual bottle from this drop down. Well, it isn't a drop down, but it will be a drop down. We'll select which bottle we're going to use. And if it's got 8.33 in it, kind of job done. We can move on to the next one. If it's got less, let's say 5, then we need to add another 3.33, and that'll have to come from the second bottle. Yeah, and this here is just going to keep us on top of how much we've currently selected. So it basically has done the same for the VG, and it tells us again the volume of VG, the weight of VG, and it does the same for PG, and it does the same for our two ingredients. So it's basically saying we need 10% of vanilla custard, which happens to be 20 ml, because don't forget we are creating, don't forget we are creating a 200 ml. So even my mental arithmetic tells me that 10% of 200 is 20. As generally speaking, the PG flavorings weigh 1 gram per milliliter. That means it's 20 grams of that ingredient. 3% of dulce de leche equals 6 ml, which equals 6 grams. And that is our recipe. Now what we need to do is we need to clean up some of the bits and pieces here. For a start, we haven't done anything about coding the abort button, so that if we get to this stage and decide, well, I don't really want this mix anymore, abort, pull back, then we click the abort button, and it basically undoes everything we've done here, which is a little bit more complicated than just scrapping it, because all of these have now been created, and all of these, more importantly, have been created in the database tables. So we actually need to go in and find all the bits that have just been created and delete them all. So yeah, we'll get around to that. We also have to get around to doing the consume button, because at the moment, yeah, it's telling us what we've used, but it hasn't actually reduced any stock amounts, and we haven't even told it yet which stock, i.e. which bottles we're taking this from. So there's a few things to be tidied up yet, and we'll get to that tomorrow. Watching paint dry would be more interesting.